one of you felt restricted to spiritual practices that often seem outdated and of little relevance in today's world? Are you discouraged to express your own creative talents and develop spiritual practices that are uniquely you? The Liturgical Rebels podcast is for people like you who want to reimagine and reconstruct their faith and spiritual practices. It's for those who want to reshape belief and journey closer to God's wholeness with peace, justice, and flourishing, not just for themselves, but for the earth and all its inhabitants. In today's episode of Liturgical Rebels, we will continue our series on Celtic spirituality. I will be in conversation with Christine Valters Paintner, a Benedictine oblate and the online Abbess at Abbey of the Arts, a virtual monastery integrating contemplative practice and creative expression. She is a poet and the author of more than 20 books on the spiritual life. Her newest book is A Midwinter God, Encountering the Divine in Seasons of Darkness. Christine lives on the wild edges of Ireland with her husband, John, and dog, Sawney, where they lead online programs with a global community. Christine, it's such a delight to have you with us here today.
Thank you, Christine. It's wonderful to be here with you.
I was thinking as I was getting ready for this, how long ago it was, and I can't remember what year it was that I first met you in Seattle. But
it was about 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, 20 years ago. But I remember discussing our common interest in Celtic spirituality and, of course, writing and simple living, lots of things that we had in common. And since then, your life has followed the kind of journey that I think is reminiscent of the Celtic saints, holy wanderers. And I think that's a great term that I'd love to apply to you too, for whom all of life was a pilgrimage. And so I was just wondering, tell us a little bit about your journey through life from place to place. And just that.
Yeah. I have lived in a number of places, and just like a brief snapshot in terms of early life. I grew up in New York City. I moved to California after college for volunteer work, ended up getting married there. Lived in San Francisco for graduate work, went up to Seattle because we fell in love with the place. And then that's sort of when the more of the conscious, I think, pilgrimage of life began. So certainly in terms of feeling connected to that ancient Celtic practice of peregrinatio. And, eventually, after several years of living in Seattle, I actually, we felt this call to move to Europe, my husband and I. We had been on several, what I would call ancestral pilgrimages to different countries where we have lineages, UK, Latvia, Austria, Slovenia, Czech Republic, all of those places, and of course, Ireland. Now, my husband has the lineage here in Ireland. Mine's more British. But we felt this call. We moved to Austria first because that's actually where my father was from and where I spent a lot of time as a child. And my father and my grandparents are buried there. And it was magical and terrifying because, my husband had a full-time job in the States teaching, and we let go of that, all the securities. Yes. Of, a regular salary and health insurance and all of those things. And we sold everything that we owned, which was its own kind of journey itself in terms of letting go. We decided to sell our home rather than renting it out and holding on to it. We just sort of felt like we were getting pushed into the unknown, and we wanted to be as free as possible to make that journey. And, when we got to Vienna, we loved it, although my husband doesn't speak German. So that was its own kind of barrier. And then the immigration process was very challenging. And of course, all of that is part of the pilgrimage journey, right? We keep bumping up against things that are not what we expected, not how we thought it was going to turn out. And all the way along, Ireland was plan B in our heads. We had called it that from the start, not because we didn't love Ireland, but, Austria was sort of the first port of call because of my own, love of the place. And we ended up in Ireland because we had heard from people that um, the immigration process for the spouse of an EU citizen is easier than in your own home country. It's kind of a complicated mess. But all to say that we ended up coming to Ireland and moving to the west of Ireland, in part because Dublin felt too much like a big city and we didn't really want that, felt a little impersonal. And we knew that Galway was an arts community, a thriving arts community, and it's on the wild western edges of Ireland. And so there's something it's something very elemental here that I really, really love. And we've been here in Ireland now 12 years and, continued that pilgrimage in various ways. For many years, we were leading people on pilgrimage here. And then, of course, the pandemic happened. And just due to my own kind of health issues, we pulled back from the in-person programs and now do virtual ones. And we also lead virtual pilgrimages. So pilgrimage is very much at the heart of sort of how I understand my life, at least, and kind of where we've ended up. But we've definitely followed the wind, so to speak, in a lot of ways, and are grateful for where we've landed.
Well, it's interesting because I'd forgotten some of that, and it, in many ways, of course, reminds me of my own journey, giving up medical practice in New Zealand and literally selling everything, no job, no security, nothing, and joining the mercy ships, and then talk about pilgrimage all over the world, and finally ending up here in Seattle. And even though I've stayed in the same place, there have been a lot of elements of pilgrimage continuing to be associated with life and the uncertainties and the richness of God that I think comes in the midst of all of that is amazing.
Yes, absolutely. I feel like I was going to say my understanding of the divine, but it's not, it's more like a journey into the mystery of the divine. So it's not so much an understanding as it is I like to use the word yielding a lot, or, allowing what's unfolding and trusting in that process of that divine ripening in my life, which takes an awful lot of trust. And some days I have more of it than others.
Well, that's human, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, Christine, you are a prolific author, and a lot of the books that you've written have really impacted my life. Starting with, I think the first one that I read that really opened my eyes was your book, Eyes of the Heart, Photography as a Christian Contemplative Practice. And then Lectio Divina, and then your Desert Fathers and Mothers. And the last one that I read, The Love of Thousands, which I found very challenging and stretching, but very, very profound too. And I think that you are a woman of great wisdom. So I'd love you to share a little bit of your spiritual journey and the books that have come out of that, how that spiritual journey has guided your writing.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for all the kind words. And writing is my first love. Like I could remember writing when I was as young as maybe 5. And and I've always, the funny thing is I went to graduate school to get my PhD in Christian spirituality, thinking it would make me a better writer. And in some ways it did, but it also made me a very academic writer. And I had to unlearn a lot of that. But anyway, all to say that my writing has guided a lot of my own journey, and certainly my love of creativity and creative process. But, I was raised in an agnostic home, and it wasn't until I went to university at a Jesuit college in New York City called Fordham university, where it wasn't even until my last year there that I stumbled into the campus ministry office because I wanted to join the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. And I laugh because their principles of JVC, their 4 principles are simplicity, social justice, community, and then spirituality. And spirituality, I remember going into the campus ministry office saying, I can get behind the other 3, but I just don't know about this spirituality thing. And, it's like God has such a good sense of humor because it's become my entire life. And, not to say I wasn't a spiritual or thoughtful person before then, but I hadn't, I didn't have a framework for it. I hadn't really engaged in it that way. And, that sort of sent me on, the campus minister sent me on a retreat, and I ended up joining the Jesuit Volunteer Corps and moving to California. So my early experience of spiritual practice was really rooted in Ignatian tradition and very much connected to justice work and social service kind of work. And then I eventually went on to teach high school and also started my doctoral work, my master's work, and then my doctoral work. And during that time, I was training in spiritual direction and retreat work because I have very much a scholarly heart, so that guided me. I always knew I was going to get a PhD in something, in part because my parents both had PhDs, and it was just that was just the atmosphere of my house growing up. So I always had the scholarly heart, but I also have always had this heart of like wanting real connection and intimacy with people. And, spiritual practice to me is very relational and very much about, there is a lot of silence and solitude in it for me, but ultimately it happens in, that kind of relational field, I think. And so while I was doing all that academic work, I was also moving more deeply into what I think ultimately would become my calling in terms of my ministry, which has been this more spiritual direction and retreat work. And during all of that, I fell in love with Benedictine spirituality through Saint Hildegard of Bingen. She was the first one I discovered in my doctoral studies, and I fell in love with her. She's a 12th century Benedictine abbess who was a visionary and a musician and a writer and a preacher and herbalist and so many things. And because I already had a heart of spirituality and creativity connected, she lit that up for me. And I wanted to know more about who this woman was and discovered she was a Benedictine abbess, and I had to know more about that. And then when I started to learn more about Benedict, I still have a great love of Ignatian tradition, and it still very much infuses much of what I do. And I was formed in that a lot. But the monastic path, I realized, was really, really met me at who I was, kind of at heart. And there's a sense of that call to more of that silence and solitude. That call to, I found Benedictine spirituality a very gentle tradition in terms of, and balanced. So I've had chronic illness since my 20s. And so it really kind of met me. Benedict talks about, how there shouldn't be anything harsh or burdensome, and those who are ill should actually get more care and things like that. That really delighted me. And then from the Benedictine tradition, which shaped me, my husband and I went on a trip to Ireland in, I think it was 2007. And that's where I started to read more about Celtic spirituality and realized, this is even more sort of meeting me where I am, especially around the connection with nature. And just so much of that wisdom really lit me up also. And so those strands of Celtic and Benedictine, and they actually brought me back to the Desert Mothers and Fathers because it was their influence. So sometimes you have to keep going back, through the lineage to see what is this original root. That's some of, and those are the 3 main strands, in addition to some of the other kind of medieval mystics as well that I'd feel very connected to. And they've carried me on this boat that I've been floating on into the work that I do. Yeah.
It's wonderful to hear that, and to hear, how God has led you through these different streams and continues to do that,
Yeah, yeah. And
Uh,
yeah. Oh, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I know it was reading your book, Desert Fathers and Mothers, that made me aware of the fact that the Celtic saints had really been so influenced by them. And that to me is fascinating, because you think of the distance that they
Yeah.
had to travel often to meet these people. And yet, obviously, they did that. And that was intriguing to me.
Yeah, there's some people who are doing studies, and there's not a lot of direct evidence, but there is enough to make a pretty compelling case over how that wisdom tradition was transmitted across that distance is really amazing. But of course, the Celtic monks were seafaring
Yes.
people, so they definitely got around.
What would you say are the main things about the Celtic tradition that inspire you?
Well, I'd say certainly this idea of nature as the big book of Revelation is a primary one. This idea of nature as, original sacred text or original scripture, I like to refer to it as sometimes. This sense of, living in Ireland, I've experienced something I've never experienced anywhere else, which is how deeply rooted and intertwined the landscape is with stories.
Mm.
And I'm sure in other places I've lived, you would find that if you were part of a more indigenous population who were more connected. So Ireland does have that benefit of having, still having this indigenous population, even though they were, of course, occupied by the British for many years. Um, and the indigenous language, but every place name has a story. There's mythology everywhere you go. There's holy wells and church ruins and passage tombs, and so there's stories everywhere. And I find that just amazing. And of course, the landscape itself is stunning and moody and difficult at times, especially in the winter when the rain is pouring sideways. But there's something about that elemental aspect which really, can strip away, what isn't needed and bring you closer to that divine presence. And then the other thing I'll say is this kind of idea of the spiral path, which I sometimes teach about, is this idea of, for me, Celtic spirituality is very much not a linear way of being and knowing. It's very much about attending to the unfolding. The book that I wrote about Celtic spirituality is called the Soul's Slow Ripening. And that idea of that slow ripening, I think, is one of the things I love too about Celtic practice. And of course, all the stories of the Celtic saints and the animals that they had kinship with. Yeah, there's a lot.
Oh, they're so wonderful. I know I'm just working on a Celtic Advent book, and I am just so enjoying rereading a lot of those stories, those delightful stories. It's just fascinating. It really is. And of course, one of the books where you talk a lot about this too is Earth, Our Original Monastery. And I love, and maybe because I have an affinity for this as well, you talk about Earth as our original cathedral, original scriptures, original saints, original spiritual directors, original icon, sacrament, and original liturgy. And I love that, because that sense of connectedness to the earth that we're supposed to have in the way we practice our faith. I remember we have an architect friend came to a spiritual retreat we did up on some undeveloped land we have up on Camino Island, north of Seattle. And I remember him sitting there one day and he said, I don't know why we need a cathedral. He said, this is the best cathedral I've ever sat in. And I've never forgotten that, because I think we are meant to worship in the midst of creation, in the midst of God's good earth, and connect to it in so many ways. So, but I know you do a lot of walking in where you are, but in what other ways does this kind of an attitude impact your life?
Yeah, well, I'll say first, just it was really living here in Ireland and um, discovering this sense of earth as being this original teacher of spiritual practice. I think we find it in other Christian mystical teachings as well. But that really inspired, it really just changed my whole perspective on things. Do you know what I mean? That earth comes
Yes.
first, of course. And so, of course, there's this idea of sacred spaces. And when you're out on the land here, you know, there's such a sense of awe and wonder and beauty and gratitude. And yes, it is exactly the original place of worship. And so when I talk about original scriptures, one of the things I talk about is the seasons. So there's a line from the poet William Stafford which says, "This earth we keep riding on," and it's something about its original scripture of leaves or scripture of leaves. And that's this image of the scripture of leaves has been one that's been working on me for, maybe 20 years after my mother died about 20 years ago. And after that, taking daily walks and moving through the seasons. She died in October. So having that letting go of autumn and then moving into the depth and the barrenness of winter and then moving into spring and summer. Although that first year, I would say I wasn't quite ready for the spring and summer, but you know, I started to trust the seasons and it started to teach me in a really intimate way about my own rising and falling and to trust even when I'm moving into those times of autumn and winter and darkness, right? That spring will come again, not in a kind of false hope sort of way, but just in a deep trust of the movements of things that when I allow myself to go to those places of letting go and resting and hibernation, that inevitably there will be some sort of new growth or new beginning. Um, and then, in terms of, I won't go through all of them, but original saints I wrote about, and particularly the animals, animal beings. And Thomas Merton has a wonderful quote in one of his books about, he talks about the mountain, the great gashed mountain is a saint, and the bass swimming in the stream is a saint, and all of this. And I know, and I remember when I first read that, I was like, oh, yes, like I already knew that. But sometimes you need someone with a little more authority to say it, and then it gives you permission to have that thought. And I know for me, my dog companion,
Oh,
Cerny,
yes.
yeah, she's named after an Irish saint. She's very much an intimate companion. And when I teach about the saints, it's, someone who is wise and well, and um, this idea that someone who lives out their true self without, as human beings, we stumble all over ourselves to listen and discern and become who we're meant to be. And we walk away from that so many times and all of this stuff. And yet animals and other living beings witness to that ability to be their true selves in the world. And so spending time with our animal companions, spending time in the garden, spending time in nature, I think can help us cultivate a sense of ease and letting go of all the chatter in our heads that keep us from that deeper wisdom. Yeah.
Yeah, I know when I became a keen gardener, it was so liberating because, like you, I discovered that new way of looking at time.
Yeah.
And it is so liberating from the rat race that kind of, as you said, I mean, it not only tells us it's linear, but it's kind of like it's an uphill climb that keeps
Yeah.
going uphill, uphill, uphill. And yeah, I think we all need to discover that liberation. Um, in the introduction to Illuminating the Way, a book that really did make me jealous because of the beautiful illustrations. And I noticed that you put up another one of these lovely illustrations on Facebook this morning, I think, and it was the greyhound Saint, I can't remember the name, but
Guinefort,
Guinefort, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
a greyhound. I thought, how delightful. I hadn't heard that before. But one of the things you talk about in that book is the importance of circles. And the comment that Carl Jung noticed that when people dream of circles, they're always symbols of wholeness. And I'm a strong advocate of circles and of circling prayers, and very much that symbol of wholeness. And I don't know if you know, but November 2nd is Looking for Circles Day.
I didn't know that, no.
It's one of the fun celebrations that I like to do, going out into my garden and around the neighborhood looking for circles. But I know you've had quite an experience of both circles and circling prayers. So can you share a little of that with us?
Yeah, well, certainly in the Irish tradition, there's a couple of different prayers that are very connected to the circle, and one of them is when you come to a holy well or you come to other kinds of sacred structures like that. There's a practice called walking the rounds, which is very important. You always walk the rounds, and there's often a prescribed number of rounds that you walk. Usually 3 or 7, some sort of sacred number. And then you always walk them in what's called a sunwise direction, but we might know is clockwise. But of course, the sun came first. We walk in a sunwise direction. And part of that practice is there's a lot of layers to it. It seems so simple on the the outside, just walk in circles, right? And so many times in our lives, right, we want to just get to the point. But the walking the rounds invites us to root ourselves, to arrive to the sacred place, to ask permission to be there, to get in touch with our own intentions. And then very much like the labyrinth, it invites us to drop out of that more linear way of thinking, more into the kind of creative right brain part of ourselves, so that by the time we have walked the rounds, we hopefully have connected a bit to the sacredness of this place. We have connected to our own heart and our intention, and we've dropped our awareness more into our hearts and are in more a posture of receiving as opposed to trying to take something or expect something. And that's, I actually have talked to people from the UK and they aren't familiar with this practice. So I think it might be indigenous to Ireland, but I find it pretty powerful. But I know there's also a similar prayer called the Chaim prayer, which I think might have originated in Scotland, where you essentially draw a circle in the air with your fingers kind of pointed down, and you turn in a clockwise direction, and you draw this circle around you. And it's very much a prayer of, another prayer of encircling yourself, asking for protection, and often done at the start of a journey of some kind or a pilgrimage. And it's very much, I think the spirit of it is very much connected to, say, a prayer like the Patrick's breastplate prayer, which, has that beautiful imagery of Christ to the right of me, to the left of me, before me, behind me, all around me. And that breastplate prayer actually has even earlier pre-Christian origins, so he wouldn't have been the first one to write that prayer. So that sense of the circles being kind of deeply rooted in the Irish imagination, and then we can draw that circle ourselves as part of our prayer practice of asking for protection. And so I find that all very powerful. And then you mentioned Carl Jung, and I love working with mandalas, and just as a personal practice, I do a lot of collage, just, collage for my own personal process of different, parts of myself that I'm dialoguing with, or I do them in circles in mandalas form.
Lovely. Yeah.
And I find it, a lot of soul collage cards are rectangular, which is fine, but I find something about the circle is very honoring of the wholeness that we all contain.
Yeah, I haven't worked with mandalas, but I like to paint rocks. So I'm always looking for round rocks so that I can do that circular pattern on them, because that's definitely the pattern I enjoy as well. Fascinating. You describe yourself as a monk in the world. and call others to a similar kind of commitment. And I love your name of your holy disorder of dancing monks, that beautiful kind of playful sound to it. And of course, your online monastery, Abbey of the Arts. And this is just such a wonderful, I think it's been such a wonderful resource to so many of us. So tell us a little bit more about it and how you live it out in your own life.
Yeah, well, Abbey of the Arts came together. We've actually been going for 18 years now, so that's kind of exciting. And as I had mentioned earlier, my love really of being practice and creative expression, bringing those together into a virtual monastery. And I'm not very tied to rules. I certainly didn't want to create a structure that was institutional or dogmatic or hierarchical or any of those things. And I think it was about 12 years ago, I was leading a retreat, and it was a writing and movement retreat. And it was actually one of the participants, one of the days said, we're not an order, we're a disorder. And everyone laughed. And I was like, yes, that's absolutely it. And so thus was born the name of kind of the group, that's sort of a part of the Abbey of the Arts, the Holy Disorder of Dancing Monks. And so for me, it's very much about learning to not take myself too seriously. And I love the image of dancing. I wouldn't call myself a dancer in terms of any professional sense, but in terms of, I like to move and dance just as part of my prayer. But sometimes I think of that dancing as simply dancing through life and dancing in the way that we meet a dancing God, that sense of playfulness and back and forth and nonlinearity. All of those things really speak to me.
Lovely. Wonderful. Now, I understand you've got a new book coming out. So why did you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, my new book is called A Midwinter God, Encountering the Divine in Seasons of Darkness. And it really had its seed in what I mentioned already about my mother dying 20 years ago and moving into that season, that external season of winter, and feeling myself really met in that place because I was in such deep grief. And that image, I think because we live in a culture that's so obsessed with spring and summer and with blossoming and fruitfulness, and is so resistant to the gifts of autumn and winter, so resistant to the letting go and to the places of rest, to the being as opposed to the doing. And there's a lot of rich tradition around the dark night of the soul, around the underworld descent, around the practice of grief, around shadow work as well, which I think is really important. That when we try and bypass those things or dismiss those things, we do a lot of damage to ourselves and I think to the wider culture because we continue to perpetuate a culture that is fearful of the dark when actually in the dark is all the good regenerative things and all the places of wisdom that we need to reconnect with. So that's what the book is about, and I've been teaching courses on it for several years now. So I'm excited to have a book format
It
for it.
sounds wonderful. It sounds like one I need at the moment. My eldest brother died just 2 weeks ago,
I'm
and
so
so I'm in
sorry.
the great grief stage
Yeah,
at the moment, and so just processing all of that
yeah,
and
yeah,
such. And we all go through grief, and yet our society kind of almost says, "Get over it. Don't talk about it. Pretend it doesn't happen."
yeah.
And so I'm so glad that you're writing this book. And it's not just grief that you've suffered, but you also suffer from chronic illness.
Hmm.
Tell us a little bit about that and how it impacts your life.
Yeah, well, when I was 21, I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune illness. And my mother had it already at that
Mm.
point for probably about 20 years. And it had ravaged her body. She had multiple joint replacements. she was in a wheelchair toward the end of her life, and her death was by massive infection, and which was caused by, years of all the drugs that she had to take. And so when I was diagnosed, I was pretty devastated. And in my 20s, for a few years, I tried to resist as much as I could because, you're in that stage of life when you're supposed to be doing and out there and discovering who you were. And I was teaching high school, and I ended up on disability for a period of time. And, that was, I think, really the first time that of my life where I was really forced to slow down. And, there was a lot of grace in discovering, the traditions of Sabbath and sabbatical and really offering it. I really was called into a deep, intimate relationship with my body. And so that grace has continued on. And, my whole adult life, I've had to deal with fatigue and having to pace myself and rest a lot. And the last couple of years of my life, the illness has been flaring more. So it's definitely sitting with what is essential in my life and reflecting on that, as well as, of course, seeking the healing treatments I can. But with a chronic illness, there is a grief that happens, and there is a kind of a wrestling with, what if it's going to get progressively worse? And so how do you reconcile yourself to that and hold yourself to that? And I would say rheumatoid arthritis has been a great teacher in my life. If I could take it away, I would in a heartbeat. And that's my path, is to carry that and to let that wound be transmuted into some kind of service to others, and to speak as truthfully and vulnerably as I can about that experience. And I know a lot of people say, like, I don't look ill, or they would never know I was ill, because I do produce a lot, but I work a lot less than people would think. Just because of the limitations of my illness. So there's, coming into that relationship with my body, with my limitations, with the grace of rest. All of those have been like the wisest of teachers for the work that I do.
Well, you do. I mean, it's interesting to me because so many of some of the best authors that I know, the most wise authors like yourself, I think, suffer with chronic illness. And maybe it's that slowing down that allows for that kind of a wisdom to develop, I think.
I do think that that's a big part of it. I sometimes say that I spend a lot of time in the horizontal perspective because I do have to rest an awful lot. And so there's something about being in that liminal space, I think, where you're not producing and you have to let go really deeply. I also think, I've been a project, another book project that I'm writing now is on some women medieval mystics who experienced their own chronic illness, because many of the medieval visionaries had illness. And so I think there is something about that breaking open, being more attuned to that liminal space and to the way the divine speaks in those places, that I do think is connected to illness and can be a gift out of that time. Is having that vision. It doesn't necessarily manifest as visions, but having that creative opening to new ways of seeing.
Well, that's certainly another book I will look forward to seeing when it comes out. So wonderful. Well, this has been a wonderful time. What is the best way for people to connect to you?
Well, if people want to go to abbeyofthearts.com, and we have loads of free resources. We have prayer cycles that are week-long morning and evening prayer podcasts that people can engage in. And we have a newsletter that people can sign up for to find out more about what's going on and get reflections from me. So there's lots of ways to get involved. But I'd say go to the website first and sign up for the newsletter, and then poke around and find all the. We have a book club.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's very rich. You have very rich resources. I agree. So wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to seeing the new book. So
Thank you, Christine. Appreciate it.
In this episode of The Liturgical Rebels, I've been in conversation with Christine Valters Paintner. She shared her journey through life, which she describes as reminiscent of the Celtic saints. She discussed her experiences living in different places, including Seattle, Austria, and Ireland, and the challenges and joys of following a pilgrimage-like path. Christine also talked about her love for Benedictine and Celtic spirituality, the importance of nature in her spiritual practice, and the significance of circles and circling prayers. She discussed her role as a monk in the world and her online monastic community, the Abbey of the Arts. Christine also shared about her upcoming book, A Midwinter God, which explores encountering the divine in seasons of darkness. In the next episode, we continue our series on Celtic spirituality, and I will be in conversation with artist Mary Fleeson, who has lived on Holy Island just off the coast of Northumberland, UK, since 1997. She studied textiles at college, then gained an honours degree in three-dimensional design in 1992. Together with her Christian faith, living on the holy island of Lindisfarne and being surrounded by its natural beauty and visible history have been the greatest inspiration for Mary's work. She also studied early manuscripts and ancient calligraphy from around the world to gain an insight into how calligraphy and illumination have enhanced works, both religious and secular, throughout the ages. Over the last 25 years, Mary has created over 120 pieces of artwork that sell as prints and greeting cards, and has written and designed over 75 books, including Celtic-style devotionals, prayer, poetry, and colouring books. Alongside creating illuminated art and writing, Mary creates meditational weavings made from found scraps and yarn, and enjoys teaching people how to create Celtic knots. I am Christine Syne, author of Celtic Advent, Following an Unfamiliar Path, a devotional book that guides us through the 40 days of Celtic Advent beginning on November 15th. My other books include The Gift of Wonder. I also facilitate the Godspace Light website and write regularly on Substack. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the podcast. Please also share it with your friends or join me on Substack, Instagram, or Facebook.